In two recent videos, links in description, we looked at William Polk's 2018 book, Crusade and Jihad, the Thousand-Year War between the Muslim world and the global north. In the first video, I showed how only about 5% of the book covered, that is to say, whitewashed, the first millennium of conflict, which largely featured Muslims invading and conquering the lands of, and massacring and enslaving Christians. In the second video, we saw that the rest of his book, 95% of it, was dedicated to the last couple of centuries, beginning with the colonial era when finally the West had reached its zenith and the Muslim world its nadir. Thanks to this intentionally lopsided approach, Polk manages to give the impression that the Christian West has always been the aggressor and Islam has always been its victim. From here, he and so many other academics and experts are able to do something else. They're able to present all the problems currently plaguing the Muslim world, from socio-economic political problems to rampant radicalization and terrorism, as a byproduct of, you guessed it, Western interference and exploitation. Islamophiles like Polk are committed to two premises. One, that for centuries Islam was a beacon of light in a dark world, and thus something must have gone horribly wrong since. And two, that which went wrong begins and ends with Western meddling via colonization, etc. As should be evident by now, and if you haven't, watch the first two videos I made about this book, the reverse is true. Islam always did what Islam does, and was constrained only during that brief era of Western assertion, the colonial era. The greater irony is that whereas jihads often culminated in slavery, depopulation, and devastation, European colonialists abolished slavery and introduced their Muslim subjects to the boons of modernity, from scientific and medical advances to the radical concepts of democracy and religious freedom. Writing in the early 20th century, a Coptic Christian summarized the status of Egypt under British rule as follows. In a word, we say that the Egyptian state was at the highest degree of justice and good order and arrangement, and it removed religious fanaticism and almost established equality between its subjects, Christian and Muslim. He's talking about British rule. And it eliminated most of the injustice, and it realized much in the way of beneficial works for the benefit of all the inhabitants. Or consider how North Africa was once among the most prosperous and civilized regions of Christendom in the 7th century before the Islamic conquest. It was home to Carthage, home to St. Augustine, and so forth. But centuries of jihading, ransacking, and the enslavement of countless souls turned it into a desert. Then, once it was entirely populated by Muslims, North Africa subsisted entirely on enslaving Europeans, centuries before the colonial era. In fact, the United States of America's first war as a nation was with these Barbary states, as the Christians referred to North Africa, land of the barbarians. When Thomas Jefferson and John Adams asked Barbary's ambassador why his countrymen were enslaving American sailors, he said nothing about open scars or the anger and frustration of Muslims, to use Polk's words. Rather, Jefferson wrote to Congress, the, quote, ambassador answered us that it was founded on the laws of their prophet, that it was written in their Quran, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them, non-Muslims, wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners. Had Thomas Jefferson actually known, the ambassador was paraphrasing Quran 9:5, the sword verse. At any rate, and rather sadly, Crusade and Jihad represents the academic and mainstream opinion concerning Islam and the West. As is typical of the social sciences and increasingly the hard sciences as well, a reality, in this case history, has been recast to conform to the accepted narrative, one which follows a rather familiar matrix. Anything white and Christian equals hypocrisy, intolerance, greed, exploitation. Anything non-white, non-Christian equals honesty, tolerance, fair-mindedness, advancement, and benevolence. Thus, and despite how Muslims persecuted Spain's Christians for centuries, here is how Polk describes the indigenous liberators, the Christians, vis-a-vis the invading occupiers. Over the centuries, the warlike Christian states pushed south into the peninsula of Spain until in 1492 they drove away tens of thousands of Muslims and put an end to one of the most advanced societies in Europe. The lesson is clear. From a historical point of view, from fake history, Islam can do no wrong, even when it invades, conquers, and persecutes. And the West can do no right, even when it defends, liberates, and civilizes. While we are to exonerate contemporary Muslim terrorism as a product of grievances against an imagined, or rather fake history of colonialism and abuse, only condemnation remains for those pre-modern Christians who set so many wrongs to rights. Such are the pseudo-histories that have long plagued the West's understanding of its relationship to Islam. It's in large part to combat these false narratives that I wrote my book, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. Not only does it document the politically incorrect facts of history, but every century gets its fair due.